Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala Nabiyyil Kareem. Firstly,
Sorry, 1 second. Is this being live?
No, this is recorded.
Not live.
I'm recording.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought it was live. I told people to know.
Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah. Thank you all for coming tonight. We're doing a topic that I wanted to do for a really long time. Some of you know that history is my area of specialty. It's a field that I'm very passionate about. Some of you have done my online history course. It's about 30 videos covering 1,400 years worth of history in 30 hours. Today we're going to attempt something a bit more challenging. Right? What I normally do in 30 hours, we're going to try and do it in 1 hour. So this is a very quick snapshot of 1,400 years worth of history in 1 hour. I actually don't know if I can do it, but we're going to try and try. There's a lot to cover. And I chose this topic because history, I think, is the one area of Islamic studies where we do not have enough information in our local curriculums. Right? Our local history focuses mainly on the stories of the prophets, the seerah, and at most the Khulafa Rashidin. And that's understandable because that's the most important part of our history. That is actually the Islamic history. What we're looking at today is not the Islamic history, it's the political history of the Muslim world. It's what happened after that. What happened for the next 1,400 years. Right? And so before we jump into it, I want to clarify a few important principles and theories that will guide your understanding of history. Because a lot of people, if they don't know Muslim history, when they first jump into it, it can be depressing, it can be shocking, because a lot of bad things happen in our history. Right? It's not all happy events, it's not all good. It's up and down, just like life. Right? In our lives, we have ups and downs, we have good times and bad times. Our history is the same. Every generation had ups and downs. So the number one principle to guide whatever we're going to go through today is that our religion is divine, our history is human. The Quran, the Sunnah, this is divine, this is our source of religion, this is where we take our knowledge from, but our history is human. You'll find the majority of Muslims to live in our history are not awliya, they are not ulama, they're just the average person with the average life, they have good and bad about them. Number two, we live in a bubble of modernity which clouds our judgment of history. A lot of the problems people have with history is not really a problem with history, but that we're living in a very unique point in history. Right? Like some people are shocked when they learn that Muslims conquered other lands. Right? They're like, why are Muslims conquering? We're supposed to be the religion of peace. Relax, conquest is part of every empire, right? Including the Muslim empires. It's going to happen. So it's our bubble of modernity that makes us look at these things like there's something strange about them, but within the context of history, it's quite normal, whether we're talking about conquests or some of the other things that happen in history. At the end of the day, our history is very human. Good things happen, bad things happen, well, boring things happen. The average person in history had a very boring life. That's why we don't write about them in the history books. They're not. We only really write about the bad things that happen. Think about it in our own lives, right? When you have a good month and everything goes your way, you don't have anything to write about in your journal or diary. Right? But when you have a day where everything goes wrong, you can fill 20 pages about it. Our history is the same. Sometimes you talk about the Khalifa and he had a 20-year reign and nothing goes wrong, and his biography is like 2 paragraphs. He ruled for 20 years and there was justice. Right? And then somebody else rules for 2 years and there's a variety of terrible events that take place, and we have 50 pages describing those 2 years. So history is a mixed bag. There's going to be good, there's going to be bad. And one more point to clarify before we jump into actual history. A lot of people approach history with the wrong theory in mind. Many of us, because of the liberal environment that we grow up in and study in, we have absorbed the liberal myths about history. The main myth about history that we have absorbed is the theory of progress, right? The theory of progress is the idea that humans are getting better in every way with each passing year, right? That we are morally superior to the people who came before us. This is the theory of progress that liberalism is built upon, right? This is why they say things like, it's 2024, why do you still believe that? It's 2024, how can you still have that belief? This theory is fundamentally opposed to the teachings of Islam. Why? Because we believe that the best generation is who? Which generation is the best? Rasulullah ﷺ and the Sahaba. And after that, each generation gets a little bit worse in terms of their overall iman and practice. Not to say they aren't to be good people, but the further away we get from the time of Rasulullah ﷺ, the more morally corrupt society becomes. Right? So the theory of progress is completely a myth in the Islamic worldview. Rather, we believe the best of times in terms of morality, in terms of faith, in terms of piety, is the first generation of Muslims. And the further away we get from that, the closer we get to Qiyamah, the worse humanity gets. Right? And this is why we don't try to liberalize the deen. Because we know that what will save the later generation is what saved the earlier generations. So this theory contradicts a fundamental of our religion. Instead, I want us to look at history to two other theories. The first theory is what I just mentioned, the theory of spiritual decline, which means that human piety peaked with the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba, and every generation after that is not as pious collectively. Two evidences for this: the hadith, khairul quruni qarni, right? That the best of generations is my generation, then the one after them, then the one after them. Right? So the Prophet ﷺ tells us that there's a downward slope in terms of piety. Second proof of this surah, Al-Waqiyah, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the people of Jannah, He puts them into two groups, the pious and the average Muslim. With the pious, He says, سُلَّةٌ مِنَ الْأَوَّلِينَ وَقَلِيلٌ مِنَ الْآخِرِينَ. Many of the early Muslims were pious. In the end of time, it will be very few. When it comes to the average Muslim, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, after describing Jannah for them, He says, سُلَّةٌ مِنَ الْأَوَّلِينَ وَسُلَّةٌ مِنَ الْآخِرِينَ. There will be many in the early generations, and there will still be many in the later generations. What these two verses of the Quran are predicting is that over time, Muslims will get more in number, but less in piety, which we observe, right? So this is the theory of spiritual decline taken from this hadith and this verse of the Quran. The other theory I want you to keep in mind as we go through the ups and downs of history is the theory of cycles of power. This theory was initially made popular by Ibn Khaldun, rahimahullah, in his Muqaddamah. So Ibn Khaldun lived at the time where the Andalusian Empire was in decline, and he came up with this theory, which is that every empire goes through a rise, a peak, and eventually a decline, and this includes Muslim empires. Muslim empires are not immune to this, and we see this happening over and over again in our history. So when we look at history, we need to understand two things. The time of the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba is the golden age in terms of piety. After that, we have a variety of empires. Every empire has their golden age. The golden age is not necessarily a golden age of piety, but a golden age of prosperity in terms of being the wealthiest, most powerful empire in the world. But then every empire also rises and falls. Right. So now, let's try and go over 1,400 years of history in 45 minutes. Right? Starting with the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I'm not going to go through the seerah, you all should be familiar with it. If we do that, it will take us another 60 hours. But we know Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam comes about at the time where there's two major empires, the Roman Byzantium Empire and the Persian Empire. Arabia is basically a bunch of tribes and villages. There's no real civilization there. There's no real structure or community there in the sense of what the Romans and the Persians were. Rasulullah is born in Makkah. He preaches Islam there for 13 years. He's forced to make hijrah to Yathrib, which becomes Madinatul Nabi. Then there is a war between Makkah and Medina for a few years, followed by a peace treaty, followed by the conquest of Makkah, followed by the conquest of the entire Arabian Peninsula, where idol worship is eradicated from Arabia. It becomes the land of Tawheed. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam passes away after 23 years of being a prophet, and 21 years of being a prophet, and he is at the age of 62 at the time when he passes away, and he leaves behind the Sahaba to continue his mission. Right? This part of history we all know. We taught this in school, we taught this in madrasa. This is the most important aspect of history, the seerah. If you don't know the seerah, buy a book, download a podcast, attend a class. This is the most important part of history to study, because this is where you take your religion from. You take your religion from the life of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his Sahaba, not necessarily those who come after them. So after Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we have the period known today as the time of the Khulafa al-Rashidin, the rightly guided Khalifas. Obviously, when they were alive, they didn't call themselves the rightly guided Khalifas. They all just tried their best, right? And these are the 5 great Sahaba who ruled at the beginning. This difference of opinion, are the rightly guided Khalifa 2, 3, 4 or 5? I'm listing 5 because of the hadith that the rightly guided Khilafat would last for 30 years. And really these 5 make up exactly 30 years. Right? So this is the period of piety and the golden age of spirituality for the Ummah. This is when you have the best of the best living. Right? You have Abu Bakr, Umar, Osman, Ali, Hassan. But even besides them, you have Abu Ubaidah ibn Jarrah, you have Khalid ibn Walid. You have the Ummah at its best at this time. Abu Bakr is the first Khalifa. He rules for 2 years. There is a war against the apostates. There is a war against the false prophets. The jihad of expansion begins. They conquer parts of the Persian Empire, parts of the Roman Empire. And one of the most important things that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu started was the compilation of the Quran. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu passes away within 2 years. Umar radiallahu anhu becomes the next Khalifa. From all of these reigns, the most important to study is that of Umar radiallahu anhu. Right? He rules for 10 years, and a lot of important things happen in these 10 years that shape our understanding of Islam and our understanding of history. One of the main things that happens at this time is that this is one of 2 points in our history where the Muslim empire grows the fastest. Right? There are 2 points in history where the empire expands the fastest. The time of Umar and the time of Walid ibn Abdul Malik. So in the time of Umar, the Persians are defeated. The superpower of the world, the Persians, are completely wiped out. And all of those lands, Iraq, Iran, and all those surrounding lands, become part of the Muslim world. And they become Muslim lands. So the Muslims have defeated a superpower and taken over all of their lands. Likewise, from the Romans, they conquered Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and a variety of other lands as well. That whole area that we today call the Middle East becomes Muslim lands during the time of Umar radiallahu anhu. Umar radiallahu anhu lives a simple, pious life in Medina. There's lots of beautiful stories about his reign and amazing things that he did. Eventually, he is murdered in Medina, and Osman radiallahu anhu becomes the Khalifa for about 12 years. In the first half, the conquests continue. The Muslims form their first navy. They start going over the ocean. They start fighting countries across the ocean. And the second half of his reign is a time of political unrest. So a lot of new people convert to Islam in faraway lands, and rumors spread in those lands, negative rumors about Usman radiallahu anhu. People believing the rumors, they get riled up, rioting begins, looting begins. They get to Medina, they sack the house of Usman radiallahu anhu in the month of Zulhijjah, and they murder him in his home while he is fasting in the month of Zulhijjah. And this causes massive turmoil across the Muslim world, because this is the first time in history that a Muslim ruler, a pious Muslim ruler, is killed by Muslims. So this plunges the Ummah into civil war. Right? The death of Osman plunges the Ummah into civil war. He passes away, he is murdered. Ali radiallahu anhu becomes the Khalifa, but not everybody accepts him as Khalifa, and the Ummah ends up being split. So we have now a period of civil war. Ali radiallahu anhu first fights some of the Sahaba, his army rather fights some of the Sahaba's army over some political issues, and then there's a massive war between him and Muawiyah radiallahu anhu over the Khilafat, and Ali radiallahu anhu is murdered by some extremists, the Khawarij, and his son Hassan comes into power. Hassan, wanting nothing to do with all of this politics and civil war and infighting between Muslims, after 6 months he gives up the Khilafat, he hands it over to Muawiyah radiallahu anhu, and the rightly guided era is over and the Umayyad era begins. Just a couple of notes here. The rightly guided era is the most important part of our history to study after the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If you have not studied it, please make time to study it. Right? Number 2, when discussing the differences between the Sahaba, even the civil wars between them, it is important that we maintain the adab and respect for all of the Sahaba. Right? That you do not vilify them or curse them or talk bad about them. You do it in a respectful way. It was a heated time, everybody felt they were right, everyone felt they were right in fighting for a just cause, and things happen. It's just the human nature. You see the human side of the Sahaba in times like this. So Muawiyah becomes the Khalifa, and he has a 20-year reign of peace and justice, which is really one of the best reigns of the later era. But in his reign, the Ummah transforms. A lot of people find this transformation to be negative. I don't consider it negative or positive, I consider it necessary, right? That Muawiyah radiallahu anhu notices that there's a lot of infighting. Furthermore, the three Khalifas before him were assassinated, right? So this idea that the Khalifa is just sleeping in a masjid and being a person of the people, it's not working, they're getting assassinated like that, right? So it makes sense that he makes some changes, right? He gets bodyguards. Every Khalifa after this for the rest of our history has bodyguards. When you think about it realistically, 3 people before you were assassinated, it's realistic you're going to get bodyguards. You're going to start living in a palace. You're going to start protecting yourself, right? So it's the time of Muawiyah that really we see the transformation of the Khilafat into a monarchy, into an empire, a empire-style monarchy very similar to the Romans. So basically they mirror some of the political ideas of the Romans and the Persians, and the Muslims now become this empire. And yes, in terms of piety, the Khulafa al-Rashidin era is better, but I don't think the Ummah would have survived and grown to the power that it did in the later times if it never really became this type of empire. Just to survive all the wars that were to come with the Romans and with the later on the Mongols and the Crusaders, it needed the stability of how a monarchy ran. So it is a very contested part of our history, whether the monarchy system is good or bad. I'm of the opinion that it is neutral, it is just a political necessary of that time and something that was needed to maintain the stability of the empire. So we have the first monarchy. Now from this point onwards, our history is empires, it's monarchies, it's kingships. For the rest of our history, right till World War I. For 1,300 years, our history is empires. Each empire has a rise, it has a peak, it has a golden age, it has a fall. The first empire is the Umayyads. The Umayyads, Banu Umayyah, are a branch of the Quraysh, Muawiyah and his descendants, and Marwan ibn Hakam and his descendants. They are a branch of the Quraysh, right? And they essentially ruled the Ummah for about 90 years. It's a very short empire, but there's a bit of a plot twist there towards the end. We'll come to it in a bit. They ruled for about 90 years, and during this time, the Muslims really become a superpower. This is really a miracle if you think about it. Islam starts in the desert of Arabia, in small towns and villages, and within 80 years, it is a superpower. It is literally one of the mightiest empires in the entire world. Right? So the Umayyads, particularly Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, he turns it into a proper empire. He comes up with the idea of having an official language, having a flag, having their own currency. So before this, Muslims used Roman currency and Persian currency. In the time of Abdul Malik, they start to develop their own currencies. Right? So it really becomes an empire at this time. It now has its own flag, it has the official Arabic language being Arabic, it has a tax system, it has an official army, it has borders with the other empires, it has peace treaties with other empires, it has its own currency. It's now really a global superpower. And this brings in a period of, for the first time in Muslim history, real material success. The Ummah becomes, especially the government, the Umayyads become wealthy overnight. And the Ummah has not experienced this before. So for many of the Umayyads, this wealth proves to be too much of a test for them, and they end up indulging in a very lavish lifestyle that upsets the ulama and the pious Muslims. Right? Because again, imagine if you lived during this time. You lived through the time of Umar and Osman and Ali, and then a few decades later, your Khalifa is a wealthy man who drinks alcohol. Right? It's a huge shift, and this led to rebellions. This is why the empire never lasts very long. People rebelled against them. Other political parties rose up and gained popular support, particularly the Abbasids, who then stage a coup, they take over the empire, they massacre the Umayyads, and the Abbasid empire begins. So just a pause here again and take some notes on this. The Umayyads in general are portrayed very negatively in our history, right? Mainly because most of the history books are written in the Abbasid era. So the Abbasid historians are going to portray the Umayyads negatively to justify the coup, right? In my opinion, there's not much difference between the Umayyads and the Abbasids. Their style of leadership is very similar. The Abbasids made a lot of false promises to come into power. A lot of false promises, right? They're very much like the politicians of today. That they promise they'll put someone from the Prophet's family in charge and they'll have a pietistic rule and they'll bring back the leader, ulama into positions of power. All this talk. Once they come into power, they're exactly the same as the Umayyads. Really, the style of leadership is almost the same. So, I don't really buy into this whole idea that the Umayyads were evil and the Abbasids were good. They were both human. Right? They were both human. They had their good and their bad qualities. One of the Umayyads that stands out is Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. I've written an entire book about his life, 300-page book about his life. I highly recommend reading about the life of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. He was the most pious of the Umayyad rulers and the one who did the most good for this ummah. So his biography is worth studying in details. So we say the Umayyad Empire ends. There's a plot twist. During the time of Walid ibn Abdul Malik, he was one of the Umayyad rulers. Remember I mentioned that during 2 reigns, the Muslims conquered a lot of lands. First was Umar and the second is Walid. In the time of Walid, the Muslims conquer all of North Africa, parts of India, Samarkand, and most importantly Spain. They conquer Spain. So now a part of Europe becomes Islamic, right? Spain becomes a Muslim land and will remain so for 700 years. So when the Abbasids massacre the Umayyads, a story takes place that really sounds like something out of a movie, right? A very young Umayyad prince manages to escape, goes on the run, goes into hiding, spies hunting down, he literally swims across an ocean, he disappears for a few years, living under false names, he finds his way into Europe, and the people of Europe are still loyal to the Umayyads because they are the ones who liberated them from the Christian rulers, and he establishes a second Umayyad empire in Spain. So the Abbasids and the Umayyads are now 2 separate empires at the same time, and that empire lasts for another 300 years. So some people think the Umayyads lasted for 90 years. In reality, they go on for another 300 years in Spain where they have their golden age. And again, another myth about history at this point. A lot of people think that we had one Khalifa until World War I. It's a complete myth. We only had one Khalifa until the coup by the Abbasids. Once the Abbasids took over, you have the Umayyads in Spain, you have the Abbasids in Baghdad, and many more start to pop up claiming to be Khalifas. Right? Because the Ummah now grows too big for one person to handle, for one family to handle. It just grows too big and it starts to split up. Before I continue, I just want to make a note here. A lot of people don't understand how the empire works in terms of Sharia. So here's an important note. The Sharia, or the law of the land, was not handled by the government. This is very important. This is why the law of the land remained the same during the time of the Khulafa Rashidin, the Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Ottomans. The law of the land remained the same. The law of the land under Islam was actually handled by the ulama. Right? So when the Umayyads came into power, basically you end up with 2 separate power structures. You have the empires. They handle jihad, they handle protecting the borders, they handle taxes, they handle administration. Right? That's the role of the Khalifa and his governors. They are handling all of that. The actual making of the laws, or rather interpreting of the Quran and Sunnah, because our laws come from the Quran and Sunnah, the interpretation of the law and the applying of the law and the enforcing of the law is done by the ulama, the fuqaha, the muftis, and most importantly the qadis. That's why, even for example, when the Abbasids take over, the law of the land doesn't change at all. It's still Sharia. Right? Ottomans take over, it's still Sharia. The law stays the same because they had a separate structure. It's not like today, where the government controls everything. Under Sharia, the government barely controls anything. Right? Really, under Sharia, there's actually a lot more freedom. And there's a lot more levels of power. There's decentralized power. Tribal chiefs have a level of power. Heads of the household have a level of power. Ulama have a level of power. There's decentralized power. The Khalifa basically handles politics, which is jihad, protecting the borders, administration, and collecting and distributing the taxes, right? Which includes the zakat. So the law remains the same. Okay. We have half an hour and we've got 3 more empires to go through. So let's see how quickly we can do this. The Abbasids come into power and they are the empire that lasts the longest. Between 600 to 800 years, depending on how you define the end of the Abbasid Empire. Because historically, there's 2 points that's called the end of the Abbasid Empire. Point number 1, that most of us know, the Mongols invade, they destroy Baghdad, and that's the end of the Abbasid Khilafat. And for many people, that's the end of the Khilafat because they're the last Qurayshi rulers. What many people don't know is that there was a sort of Abbasid ruler after that in Egypt for another 200 years until the Ottomans defeated him. That's why there's a difference of opinion of when the Abbasid Empire ends. So the Abbasids come into power, they have the same cycle. They rise, they have a golden age, and then they have a decline, and then they end. But the golden age of the Abbasid Empire is important. It coincides with the golden age of Spain. Because at this point in time, the Muslims become the most powerful empire in the world for 300 years. For a 300-year period, the most powerful people in the world are Abbasid Baghdad and Umayyad Spain. The Muslims are the most powerful people in the world. Not just in terms of politics, but in terms of technology, in terms of education, in terms of research, in terms of science, in terms of all these things, the Muslims become the world leaders. The rest of the world goes to the Muslim lands to study. They become the dominant power of the world. They influence the world, and their influence is still felt today throughout the world. Many of the things we have today are built upon the discoveries made during that time. Many of the policies we have today are built upon policies that they invented. Muslims invented a university system. They invented the idea of medical colleges, that you can't be a doctor without a degree. They invented many things that we take for granted today during this golden age. So this is a very important part of our history, the Abbasid golden age, where the Muslims are wealthy, they have freedom, they have power, they have access to resources, and really we see the Muslims becoming world leaders in every field. Like almost any field you study, if you go back to that point in time, the main people developing those fields at that point in time are Muslims. Muslims invent algebra during this time. Right? So all you kids who are struggling with algebra in school, you can blame the Muslims for that. Right? Our forefathers invented algebra so they can solve inheritance problems and zakat problems. That's what it was invented for. And many other inventions as well. However, the Abbasids are only powerful for about 300 years. After that, we have what I consider the weakest part of our history in terms of power, where basically the Abbasid ruler becomes just like a figurehead, like a symbolic type of Khalifa, without any real power. And what happens is the Ummah grows too large, each region has its own ruler, and no one really takes the Khalifa seriously anymore. For about 300 years this lasts, where no one really takes the Khalifa seriously anymore. They pay lip service to him, but he doesn't have any real power. Think of it like what the King of England is like today, right? The King of England today is technically the king of many countries. Do any of those countries take him seriously? Does he actually make laws for those lands? Or is he more of a symbolic role? Right? That's basically what the Caliphate becomes in the late Abbasid era. At the same time that the Abbasids reach the golden age, Spain also goes through a golden age. So I mentioned the story of the great Umayyad king, Abdul Rahman ibn Muawiyah. Study him, amazing story. He flees to Spain, he establishes a separate empire. His descendants ruled over Spain for 300 years. This is the introduction of knowledge and civilization to Europe. Before this, Europe is in the Dark Ages. It's a backwards land full of barbarian type of people, right? It's really not considered worth going to, it's not considered worth investing in. Muslims come to Spain, they set up schools, they set up universities, they bring in technology, and the rest of Europe learn Arabic, go to their universities, learn from them, take it back to their lands. So for example, during this period, a philosopher comes about in Spain known as Ibn Rushd. Ibn Rushd's philosophy influences the Europeans that leads to the Renaissance and leads to the development of modern philosophy. Right? There is a very immediate impact on Islam, from Islam upon the European world during this period. However, no empire lasts forever. The Muslims of Spain, just like every other empire, they rise, they have 300 years of golden age, and then they have the decline. And the decline of Islamic Spain was the first major shock in our history. Because this is the first time in our history where the Muslims lose an entire country back to the non-Muslims. Right? This is like 700 years after the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So imagine, for 700 years, the Muslims are conquering lands and spreading Islam, but they don't ever really lose any major territory for 700 years. And then suddenly what happens is that Spain becomes divided. Muslims start fighting over power. And for a few hundred years, there's a civil war between the Muslim and Christians, each with their small kingdoms in Spain. And then the Crusades take place, and the Crusaders inspire in Spain something called the Reconquista, to reconquer the land. The Christians reconquer Spain while the Muslims are fighting each other. And they wipe out Islam from Spain completely, to such an extent that most Muslims today don't even know that Spain was ever Islamic. Right? Many Muslims don't even have no clue that for 700 years this was a Muslim land, and that this was really, it was such a beautiful Muslim land that people used to call it Jannah on earth. That's how beautiful and well developed it was. So this was like the first major shock in our history, that you could lose an entire land and never get it back. It's gone, it's no longer a Muslim land. Right? Spain is reconquered, the Muslims and Jews are either exiled or massacred. Interesting note, Judaism survived because of the Muslims. Right? Under Islam, Jews and Christians had complete freedom of religion, to such an extent that they could even enforce their own Torah and gospel laws in their own communities. So the Jews, they lived in Spain under Muslim rule, and they were able to thrive because of that. When the Christians come in and want to massacre everyone, who takes in the Jews? The Ottomans. They move back to a Muslim land under Muslim rule. Really, Islam protected Judaism from falling apart and going extinct, because the Christians were always trying to kill them. So while the Spanish Empire is falling apart, the same thing happens to the Abbasids. Right? The Abbasid leader doesn't have any real power. He becomes a figurehead. He becomes somebody who people say, oh, he's a Khalifa, I'm just the people. What people will do in that time is, someone will say, oh, he's a Khalifa, I'm just the governor. Or he's a Khalifa, I'm just the military leader. But they wouldn't consult the Khalifa in anything, and they'll just do their own things. Right? So for about 300 years, there's just a lip service to the Abbasid Khilafat. And really during this time, when you study this point in history, you almost never study the Khalifas themselves, because they're just useless people with like no real power. You study people like Salahuddin Ayyubi and Nuruddin Zinki, because these are the people who have actual power. Many of us, we think they were Khalifas. They weren't Khalifas. They were military leaders who pledged allegiance to the Abbasid Khalifa. So about 300 years, the Abbasids are in a state of falling apart. More and more smaller empires are popping up. More and more people are claiming to be the Khalifas. You have the Umayyads in Spain. You have the Fatimids in Egypt. You have other people popping up as well. And then you have other small kingdoms claiming to be following the Abbasids. And then two major events happen that completely devastate the Abbasid Empire. It's the end of the Abbasid Empire. Right? The first is the Crusades. So the Crusades was basically Europe waking up. It's the Europeans realizing that they also can have power, and they also can, conquer lands. And the Muslims don't really have that border guarded, because they didn't really consider the Europeans to be a threat until that point. They too busy fighting the Byzantiums and others. And so they had that border open so that Europeans could go for pilgrimage to Jerusalem, because it's a holy land to Christians and Jews as well. And the Europeans take advantage of that. The Crusaders start. The Crusade is basically a Christian holy war against every other religion, specifically Islam. They enter the Muslim lands, they massacre the Muslims, specifically Jerusalem, Palestine. They take over that land, they rule it for 90 years. There's no Islam allowed in that land at all for the 90-year period. This is one of the most tragic and violent genocides that happened in the history of Islam. 90 years later, a military general by the name of Salahuddin defeats them and takes back Jerusalem. And then a few years later, something even worse happens. The Mongol invasion. So again, just like no one was expecting an attack from the west, from the Crusaders, they weren't expecting any attack from the east either, because to the east were the Mongols. The Mongols were just scattered nomadic tribes. They didn't really have a civilization or an army or a desire to conquer anyone. And then one guy amongst them decides to unite everyone by the name of Genghis Khan, right? Some people call him Genghis Khan, it's Genghis Khan. He unites everyone and he says, let's conquer. And what begins is one of the most barbaric, genocidal, violent conquests in the history of this world. Right? The Mongols were so barbaric and violent and unstoppable that the Muslims of that time believed that they were Yajud and Majud and that the world was ending. When you read books written at that time, people were literally writing like the world is ending. Like it's over, that's it, Qiyamah is here. You know how people today think that, Qiyamah is here and the world's ending? It was the same 800 years ago with the Mongols. The Mongols just become unstoppable. And it's really some Muslims' faults. They were willing to have peace with the Muslims, but the Muslims insulted one of their leaders and they just go on a rampage and start killing everyone. And then they reach Baghdad. If we had time to go over what was Baghdad. Baghdad, for the first half of our history, was the greatest city in the world. Right? Those kids here who play Assassin's Creed, and you see the newest one is built around what Baghdad was like during the Golden Age. You can actually walk around and see what the city was like. It was the most beautiful and well-developed city in the world at that time. It also was considered, untouchable. Yet the Mongols come in and they completely destroy the city. They destroy the Abbasid Empire. This is the end of the Khilafat. Right? For those who believe that the Khilafat has to be from the Quraysh, this is the end of the Khilafat. Right? Because what comes after this is non-Quraysh. And so the Ummah enters a stage where there's no Khalifa. And where people think it's the end of the world. And where the Muslims are divided into many small little countries that are at war with each other. Sounds familiar? Right? A very similar period to what we're going through today. What we're going through today happened about 600 to 800 years ago. When the Khilafat was abolished, the Muslims were split into many, many empires, and there was no real political unity of power, and everyone's fighting everyone, and people thought the world was ending. But the world didn't end. New empires rose once again. And so we now have specifically 4 major empires come about. There are many smaller ones, but 4 major empires come about in this period. First are the Mamluks. The Mamluks are interesting because Mamluk literally means slaves. Right? The Mamluks are the slaves of the Abbasids. They have an Abbasid with them saying that he's the Khalifa, but they're the ones who are actually ruling. And they are able to defeat the Mongols. They become the first people to defeat the Mongols. So they maintain control of Jerusalem, Makkah, Medina, Syria, Egypt, basically, the heart of Islam. They maintain control of that part of the world. And they become the Sultanate or the Muslim kingdom in that part of the world. But they had some kind of legitimacy because they had a Abbasid figurehead with them, and they called him the Khalifa. Right? At the same time, some of the Shia in Persia, they also gather and fight back against the Mongols, and they form their own empire called the Safavid Empire that also lasts for a very long time. At the same time, what's most amazing to me is that some of the Mongols convert to Islam. Some of the Mongols who conquer the Muslim world convert to Islam, and from their descendants come new Muslim empires. One that's most relevant to us and that we really need to study is the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire were basically Mongol descendants who were Muslims that ruled over India in what became India's golden age. Right? India, under the Muslim rulers, was the wealthiest country in the world. That's why the British wanted to colonize it. They wanted that wealth. Right? It's not the India we see today. It's very important that we study the history of the Mughal Empire, because it's a forgotten part of our history that directly affects many of us. It's how we got to where we are. Right? So the Mughal Empire are the descendants of the Mongols that ruled over India. India goes through a golden age under the Mughal Empire. The most important of the empires that arise at that time is the Ottoman Empire. So what is the Ottoman Empire? And that's the last empire we will discuss before we finish off. Basically, a group of nomadic Turks realized that they need to form some cities because they're being attacked from both sides. They have the Crusaders on one side, they have the Mongols on the other side. They can't keep moving from city to city. Right? Those of you who've watched Ertugrul or the Usman series, you know what I'm talking about. By the way, those series are mostly fictional, but some aspects of it is true. Right? So basically, they form a few towns and cities, and they become like a small little kingdom that's fighting off the Crusaders and the Mongols. But here's the point I want us to think about, and I want us to realize. The Ottomans started with a small kingdom of just a few towns, and within 300 years, they become the mightiest empire in the world and a Khilafat. Today, we think that for the Khilafat to be restored, it's just going to be some magic thing where there's like a Khilafat over the whole Muslim world. But after the downfall of the Abbasid Khilafat, it took 300 years for another empire to rise up to that level. Right? And realistically, if that's going to happen again, it's also going to take about 200 to 300 years. It's not likely that you're going to see it in your lifetime. Right? But many people want everything to happen quickly. That's not how history happens. So, two things the Ottomans do that really establish their power in this world. Number one, they conquer Constantinople. Constantinople was the capital of the Byzantine Empire. It was considered unconquerable. It was the capital of the Byzantines for 1,000 years. And the Prophet ﷺ had prophesied that one day Muslims will conquer that land. And over 800 years later, the Ottomans conquer Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire is no more. And Constantinople today, what do we know it as? It's Istanbul. Istanbul was the capital of the Roman Empire for 1,000 years. So this now becomes the capital of the Ottoman Empire for the next 600 years. And this becomes the heartland of Islam for the next 600 years. Constantinople becomes, Istanbul becomes the most important city in the Muslim world. And then, feeling confident from the conquest of Constantinople, the Ottomans sort of turn on the Muslim co-rulers. Remember, there's many empires at the same time. And they fight the Mamluks, and they take over Jerusalem and Makkah and Medina from the Mamluks. Why is this important? This is important because now the Ottomans rule Constantinople, the center of Rome, and they rule Makkah, Medina, and Jerusalem, the holy lands of Islam. That's why when you read the biographies of the Ottoman rulers of this time, they will call themselves the Sultan, the Caesar of Rome, and the Khalifa of the Muslim world, and the custodian of the holy lands. Because they were all in one, right? And they become the most powerful empire in the world. Imagine that, 300 years before this, Muslims thought the world was ending. They thought the Khilafat is abolished, Yajuj and Majuj are here, and the world is ending. 300 years later, again the Muslims are the most powerful nation on earth. It happened multiple times in our history, it can happen again. Right? I'm very confident it could happen again when another empire rises, maybe in our lifetime or in the next generation or two. So they become this massive empire spread across Europe, Asia, and Africa. A lot of the Balkans, a lot of what is today Russia used to be part of the Ottoman Empire. That's why there's many Muslims living there. Really, they become the size of what is today 25 to 50 countries with 25 million people. At the height of Ottoman power, there were 25 million people living in the empire. One of the tragedies of our history curriculum is most of us don't know anything about the Ottoman Empire. And the more I study it, the more I am amazed by the systems they developed and the structures they developed and how organized they were and some of the great people that came out of this empire. So the Muslims go through a third golden age, an Ottoman golden age. The Ottomans are the dominant superpower on earth. I forgot to mention, one of the things that made the Ottomans more powerful at that time is that they weaponized gunpowder. They're known as the Gunpowder Kingdom. So they developed cannons and guns. That's how they were able to conquer Constantinople. The enemy were fighting them with bow and arrows and swords, and they were using muskets and cannons. Right? So again, the Muslims are even the most technologically developed empire of that time. So many of us may be wondering, so how in the world did we get to this? Right? The mighty Abbasids, Muslims of Spain, the Mughals, the Ottomans, and today we are at the bottom of the bottom. Right? No real countries to look up to, no way to stop a genocide from happening, no real political power. How did we get to where we are? That will be the final part of today's presentation. The Ottomans, like every other empire, go through a decline. And their decline is dealing with several major factors at the same time. Number one is colonization and the rise of the European powers. So, many people think that the Ottomans were going downhill and the Europeans were going uphill. In reality, the Ottomans sort of stagnated and the Europeans overtook them, right? Because the Europeans at this point go through the Renaissance, they go through colonization, they conquer many different lands, including many Muslim lands. Egypt, India become part of the British Empire. The Dutch conquered Indonesia and Malaysia, and many of the Muslim lands are now becoming colonized. So this weakens the Muslim world, right? Colonization weakens the Muslim world. At the same time, the Ottomans have to fight wars on multiple fronts. The war that affects them the most financially is with Russia. Russia fights the Ottomans for 300 years over Constantinople. Because Russia, before modernity, was a religious Christian empire. And they wanted the Constantinople back. They considered it part of their Christian heritage. So for 300 years, there is a war between Russia and the Ottomans. That's why many of these lands that are today part of Russia, that have Muslim people in it, those used to be Ottoman lands, right? So this really cripples the Ottoman Empire financially, this war. At the same time, they're fighting other wars. Nationalism starts to happen. People want their own nation states. They want not to be ruled by Turks anymore, right? The Saudi rebellion takes place. Many people are unaware of this. They think Saudi Arabia is a once-off thing. Saudi Arabia is actually the third Saudi kingdom. It's actually the third Saudi kingdom. Twice before that, the Saudis took over Ottoman territories and declared their own kingdom, and the Ottomans had to fight them and take the lands back. Right? So there's an ongoing war between the Saudis and the Ottomans for about 300 years as well. At the same time, the British are trying to get rid of the Khilafat. The British are doing everything because they see the Ottomans as their main enemy, right? The main obstacle to colonization, to taking over the world. And so there's a lot of spies in the Ottoman Empire, there's a lot of strategies to destabilize it from the inside. Really, the Ottomans are fighting too many wars on too many different fronts at the same time, including internally. And the economic factors lead to a period of decline, and really at one point the Ottoman Empire goes bankrupt. And in the 1800s, they tried to salvage the empire. They tried to develop new systems of education, new systems of economics, new policies, a new leadership style, a new army. They basically tried to modernize the Khilafat. Many of us wonder what a modern Khilafat will look like. If you look at the Khilafat of the 1800s, you can see the Ottomans making an attempt to modernize the Khilafat to work within the new world. I don't really agree with everything they did, but at least they tried to do something. At least they tried to make it work with all the changes that were happening in the world. And this new Khilafat, this new version of the Ottomans, which was now a modern type of empire, it never really stood a chance, because while all of these developments are taking place and while they're coming up with these new policies and new systems, an event happens. Many people don't know this, but this event is one of the most important events in Muslim history. World War I. Right? Again, when we think of World War I, we think this is British history, this is Russian history, this is Austrian history, this is German history. No, this is after the Mongol invasion and the fall of Spain. This is the most important tragic event in our history. Because the Ottomans get dragged into World War I. Right? Basically, all of the superpowers of the world get split into two sides. The Allied powers, Russia, UK, USA, France, and the Central powers, Germany, Hungary, the Ottomans, and a few others. And long story short, the Central powers lose the war. The Central powers lose the war. The British and the French literally conquer the Muslim world. 100 years ago, the British and the French conquered the Muslim world. And they split it up into all these small countries we see today. And they divided it in such a way that none of these countries have the resources to be completely independent. And they have to depend on them for something. And they set in place policies to ensure that a Khilafat never rises again. Muslims never grow as powerful as the Ottomans again. There are many other things that take place at this time as well. The rise of Zionism. Right? The Zionism rises up during this time as well. So the Zionists, they come about during the late years of the Ottomans, and they want Palestine. They really, really want Palestine. And Sultan Abdul Hamid, the last great Ottoman ruler, he tells him, as long as we are around, you're not getting this land. This is Ottoman land. This is Muslim land. You can live there, you're free to live there, but it's under Sharia, it's a Muslim land. So the Zionists, they basically fund the British war in World War I. They ally with the British, and they make a deal with the British that if you defeat the Ottomans, you're giving us that land. But some of the Arabs also betray the Ottomans, and they make the same deal with the British, that you're giving us that land. So the British defeat the Ottomans, they take over that land. The Arabs and the Zionists both want it. And meanwhile, there's people living there that's indigenous to the land, the Palestinians. And so it gets split up into Jordan, Palestine, and Israel. Many people don't realize this, but Jordan actually is supposed to be Palestine as well. Right? What is today Jordan is literally supposed to be Palestine. It was just their way of compromising with the Arabs that they promised that land to. And so the mess we are in today is a result of World War I. We are still living in the aftermath of World War I. Many people don't know this, because in World War I, the Ottoman Khilafat is abolished in 1924, exactly 100 years ago. Right? The Ottoman Khilafat is abolished. It's been exactly 100 years without a Khalifa. Right? What followed is the division of the Muslim world into many empires, into many kingdoms. And all of these many kingdoms don't really have that much power. They don't really have that much natural resources. Furthermore, the Muslim world is bombarded with forced secularism and liberalism. Right? The most obvious example being Turkey. Turkey, if you know what happened to Turkey after World War I for the next 30 or 40 years, secularism was forced on the people. People's beards were literally ripped off, their hijab was ripped off their head. It goes through a forced secularism. They have this idea that if you just force secularism on the Muslims, they'll give up their religion and they'll want to be like us. But this backfires. Because over the past 50 years, all over the world, we have seen a revival of Islam. Really, over the past 50 years, Islam has been on the rise again. Just like it was on the rise in the beginning, just like it was on the rise about 50 years after the Mongols defeated the Muslims. It's on the rise again today. In many different ways. In many different ways. The Muslim world has been on the rise again in the past 50 years, despite everything that the enemies of Islam have done to make sure that Muslims give up their religion and never grow powerful again. One of the most ironic things that has led to the rise of Islam again is that when they took over the Muslim lands and made these economies poor and destabilized these lands, lots of Muslims migrated to their lands. Right? Muslims migrated to their lands, Islam starts spreading in their lands, people from their lands are converting to Islam, and now suddenly the British are worried that the UK is too Islamic. Right? And that within 50 years it's going to be an Islamic land. That whole plan of this backfires. Islam is now spreading globally at a rate that they cannot understand. They tried to force atheism, they tried to force liberalism, they tried to force secularization. Yet Islam is spreading so fast that by 2050 it may be the largest religion in the world. It's already the second largest. And not only is Islam growing in terms of numbers, but spiritually, there are more practicing Muslims in the world today than there were 50 years ago. Especially than they were 70 or 80 years ago. Intellectually, we have far more access to Islamic knowledge and far more Islamic resources today than we had even 30 years ago. Most of us here know this. 30 years ago, we didn't have access to the resources we have today. You can study anything about Islam today at the touch of a button, and people are doing so. Right? You have seen an intellectual rise of Islam. We now have a level of scholarship that was unthinkable for a long period of time. That we have intellectual Muslim scholars all over the world. Economically, they did everything they can to ensure that Muslim countries will stay poor forever. But over the past 30 years, at least 4 or 5 Muslim countries are doing well economically. And there may be more in the next 10 or 20 years. As they start to work together, as they start to help each other, as they start to develop new ways of growing. That now there are actual Muslim countries that are amongst the most economically prosperous in the world, that are good places to live. That where, life is good again. And inshallah, more Muslim countries will be like that. So I say, and this is my conclusion. My conclusion is that many people have a negative doom and gloom attitude towards history. Many people have this idea that, we're living in the end times, so we just wait for Mahdi. Right? Nothing's going to happen, Mahdi's going to come, and then only everything's going to come right. I don't really believe we're living in the end times. Only Allah knows best when the end times could happen. It could be in 10 years' time, it could be in 1,000 years' time. Right? People 800 years ago thought they were living in the end times. And look what happened. I believe we are going through the cycle again, where Islam is on the rise, intellectually, spiritually, and economically. What comes next? The political revival of Islam, the revival of Sharia, the revival of Khilafat. I believe that a new Muslim global power will arise within the next 200 years. And there will be another mighty Muslim empire. And there will be another Muslim golden age. And there will be another fall. Allah knows best how long that will go on before the end of the world. But I don't believe in this doom and gloom attitude that the world is over, Qiyamah is close, let's just do nothing and let's wait for the Mahdi. I don't agree with that attitude. I think we can all contribute to the rise of Islam and the revival of Islam in our own way. Whether it's intellectually, whether it's economically, whether it's spiritually, we all can play a role in seeing Islam rise up again one more time, just like they did so many times. Our history is a history of every time they pushed us down, we got back up. May take 100 years, but it kept happening. And inshallah, it will happen again within our lifetime. With that, alhamdulillah, we come to the end of our presentation. Alhamdulillah, we're able to do it in exactly 1 hour. So yeah, that's 1,400 years of political history in 1 hour. If you want to learn about it in more details, I have an online course where I teach this across 30 hours, going into a lot of details of each empire. It's a very popular online course, over 2,000 students. I highly recommend, if you want to learn about this in more details, you can do the online course. And I highly recommend that we as a community, we start studying our history again. Introduce it to school curriculums, introduce it to madrasa curriculums. Read books on these topics, discuss it as families. We need to reconnect with our past. There are so many amazing things about our past that we're just completely disconnected from. We must revive the study of history. So with that, alhamdulillah, we come to the end of today's session. If there's any questions, I'll take now, and if not, we'll close up. By the way, my new book is out, 25 Keys to a Happy Life from the Quran and Sunnah. It's my latest book. It's normally $250, but today it's on sale for $200 if anybody wants.
So, you start off talking about Ibn Khaldun's theory of rise and fall of nations, empires. What we've seen over the last 100 years, obviously this post the trauma of colonialism, is an attempt at modernization. Right? So obviously you had the extreme liberal form of modernization in the form of Mustafa Kemal, and then you also had within the ulama circles like Muhammad Abdu and Jamal Afghani, trying to modernize Islam, move to science and technology. Let's throw away the ghaib, just try to take material interpretations of Quran, let's try to pursue science and technology, and then we'll be equal to the rest. Obviously, this comes with the trauma, so we mustn't be too harsh in our judgment. But how do you understand the rise and fall of nations? Allah says in the Quran, my righteous servants shall inherit the earth. Is it purely about pursuing science, technology, research and development, pursuing economic growth, pursuing tertiary education, pursuing wars, and then we rise as a civilization? Or is it something that's not necessarily a one-to-one relationship between military, economic, and political, or is the spiritual thing Allah gives it to whom He wants, when He wants, despite the best attempts?
So the way nations rise will change from time to time, place to place. There's no one model of a rise, right? I think the spiritual aspect is important to get Allah's help on the side of the Muslims, right? But obviously the intellectual and economical aspects are just as important. But just going back a little bit, what we saw on the other side of history over the past 100 years was the rise of modernity, the rise of Western powers, the rise of the liberal world order. And what we've seen over the past 10 years is the decline of that entire system. And the decline of that system is going to lead to the rise of something new, which could be a new Muslim empire as one of those new things that pop up. Because we are now living in what many non-Muslim professors call post-modernity. They call it post-modernity because the younger generation, even many of the non-Muslims, the younger generation, have lost faith in modernity. They see modernity as the previous century. They're actually skeptical about modernity. They're skeptical about capitalism, they're skeptical about feminism, they're skeptical about democracy, they're skeptical about letting go of religion. People are very skeptical even about things like education and medicine. We now have rise of skeptics in every field. So that means something new is going to come out, right? This is actually a void where Islam can fill. And we don't know how it will happen. Really, one of the roles of the intellectuals of our time is to figure out a way forward. There is no roadmap. There is no roadmap. It's something that will happen organically, and it's something that will happen when Allah wills it. And there are many verses in the Quran that indicate the rise and falls, right? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran that He alternates power between people. Now, every empire comes and it goes. Certain empires are on their way out right now, new empires will come in their place, right? I actually think the next Muslim power will probably come from Palestine. That Allah is preparing that land to be the heart of the next Muslim empire. What they're going through now is similar to what the Turks went through, that they're being attacked from both sides by the Mongols and the Crusaders, and it looked like there was no way out, and then they became a mighty empire. Right? Only Allah knows how it's going to play out. We need intellectuals to figure out a way forward. For me, the biggest obstacle to the rise of Islam right now is the nation-state model. Because Muslims are divided into nationalities, very tiny nation-states that don't like each other, that don't get along, and this is completely haram actually. I believe the nation-state model is haram. Because we are dividing Muslims in a way that creates animosity and in a way that hinders the freedom that the Sharia wanted us to have. The freedom to live anywhere in the Muslim world. So one of the major changes that will have to happen eventually is to let go of the nation-state model and find some new middle path of where you have a nation-state model, but there's some open borders and a lack of national hatred. I don't know how it's going to happen. And also the other, I forgot what the other point I was going to make about the rise and fall of nations. Yeah, sorry, the other point slipped my mind. But yeah, there is no one way forward. We are seeing Islam rise in many ways, and I don't know what's next. Yeah. Sorry, my other point slipped my mind. Yeah.
So in terms of, like you said that in like at the end of the Muawiyah, the Umayyad era, they became like more materialistic, right? So in the other empires that came in the Golden Age, is it only like politics and economics and stuff, or is it also spirituality in like the Golden Age? In terms of the Islam?
I didn't really get the second half of that.
Is the Golden Age in the following empires?
Yeah.
In the Golden Age, was it also like a revival of the spirituality of Islam, or just like economics, politics, power?
Okay, that's a good question. So, actually, I was supposed to make that point earlier, that this presentation is the political history. While the political history is happening, there's the history of Abu Hanifa, and Imam Bukhari, and the awliya, and the ulama, and the average person, and the farmers, and the businessmen, and all of this is going on. So, when you study political history, it's very dark. Right? Politics is all bad things. But if you actually look at the life of the average person on the ground, life was good for the average person, and it didn't really change much from one empire to the next. We have separate history. You can study the history of the ulama, right? And you will find a very strong spiritual history throughout all of these generations. The history of the awliya is the same thing, right? So, one of the points I mentioned earlier is when the empire grew too big and became a monarchy system, the ulama became a separate type of power from the rulers. They became a separate type of power. The ulama, for example, the qadis in the Ottoman Empire, they could pass a fatwa that the Ottoman Khalifa is no longer fit to be Khalifa and someone else can take his place. Right? They could hold the Khalifa accountable. So they were a separate power structure. And they have their own history. And that history is a bit more nicer. Right? There's more stories of spirituality, of piety, of nice things happening. It's just when you study politics, it's more studying all of these things, right? So also the other point I want to mention on that, when we study history, I don't like us to only study political history. It's actually more important for us to learn the lives of the righteous so we can benefit from their life stories, right? And the righteous, historically, most of them avoided politics. They consider politics to be something they just don't want to get involved with. That's why the names don't pop up anywhere over here. Because once the empire grows to be like, we staying away from the politics, we focus on the Sharia, we focus on fiqh, we focus on hadith, we focus on teaching the people, but we're not getting involved in, fighting over kingdoms. So yes, there's all those other types of history happening at the same time. And we could do that some other time.
So one of the points you mentioned, I think maybe you need to expand on it, was when the Ottomans defeated Byzantines, it was because of gunpowder. And if you look at political history, it's who has the biggest military might that wins, not necessarily all the other things that we have, economic power and so on. Whoever had the best army most sort of equipped army, most sophisticated army, military prowess on the battlefield, they are the people that came into power. So military power, military might was an important part of this whole thing.
Yeah. One of the problems over the past 20 years with our Islamic discourse is because of the trauma from 9/11, Muslims took a very pacifist approach to our religion. And we started kind of like putting down concepts like jihad and military power. And a lot of people who became very pacifist during that point in time, in the past 8 months, have been telling me, I now understand why jihad exists. I now understand why the Prophet needed an army, why Muslims in the past needed armies. Because I thought this whenever I taught history. I said, history, if you study it, you realize the way this world is, it's conquer or be conquered. That's the way of the world. And really, we have to get back that warrior spirit as a ummah. And victory is not going to really come militarily until Muslims develop strong armies and they're able to fight back and they're able to take back the region. Like I said, what we are in right now is still the aftermath of World War I. We haven't moved from that phase yet. And that's exactly what's going on in Israel and Palestine at the moment, is that point. So what you mentioned is exactly that we need a military revival amongst the Muslims. That would be necessary. Because they're saying, why don't the Muslim countries do anything about it? Let's face it, most Muslim countries, if they even do anything about it, they'll be wiped out in a few days. That's how powerless these countries are. So yes, redeveloping a proper Muslim army is necessary, and this is why we need to move away from that pacifist understanding of Islam, where jihad is just jihad of the nafs, and there's no conquest in our religion, and this hippie idea of the religion of peace. No, Allah, in His wisdom, gave our religion a military component because Allah knows throughout history there'll be people trying to kill the Muslims. And if Muslims don't have might, they will be as they were with the Mongols, as they were with the Crusaders, as they are today, on the receiving end. Right? So there is wisdom behind every law that Allah has revealed, including the laws related to jihad of conquest and attaining military power. There's actually a verse in Surah Al-Anfal about the importance of building military power so your enemies don't attack you.
I mean, that was what Al-Qaeda was all about. There's a pan-Islamic army consisting of people from different countries fighting colonization. Obviously, the rest is history. But it's a pan-Islamic army because they saw the importance of military might in confronting the West. Obviously, there were lots of other issues which came with Al-Qaeda.
So I just wanted to take you back to the point about the difference between the ulama and the government that was running. So I understand it was like separate, but so you gave an example of it. They gave a fatwa that so and so was not fit to rule. Was it taken heed by the rulers, or were they more dismissed? Like they just didn't mix the politics.
I'm sorry, my hearing is gone now. I get the center pointed and I do my hearing also.
Okay, so there was a difference between like the government and the rulers and the ulama.
Yeah.
So when the ulama gave a ruling on something, was it taken heed by the rulers, or
Was it taken seriously with the government?
Yes.
So the government didn't have power over the law.
Yes.
They had basically, when it came to the law, people would take their fatwas from the ulama, and they would take, if they had a problem, they'll go to a qadi, a judge, or whatever the qadi was an alim, right? And whatever the qadi decides, they will do, right? So in Islamic law, see, the way we used to in modernity, we have government laws and we have Islamic law, right? And sometimes they clash. Historically, the Muslims had the Sharia, which the ulama interpreted and ulama taught and ulama judged by. And then on issues that the Sharia is silent about, like things like taxes and things like property ownership in certain areas and traffic laws, things like that, those things the government handled, right? So for example, the Ottoman Empire had the Sharia and it had Qanun, canon law. The Sharia and canon law. The Sharia was handling halal and haram, wajib, judging between people, marriage, divorce, business, all of that was handled by Sharia. That was handled by the Shaykhul Islam, the qadis, the judges, the ulama. The canon law was more to do with taxes, more to do with traffic laws, more to do with education laws, things that the Sharia is silent on. right? And that was handled by the government, but what happens later on is they bring the ulama in to help them with that as well, right? Because one of the things throughout our history, one interesting point throughout our history is that the Khalifa is always trying to prove that he's a legitimate Khalifa. Because every Khalifa, every empire came into power through defeating another Muslim empire. So there's always people who are like, these guys took over our land. They fought Muslims to take over our land. So every empire wants to prove they're a legitimate Khalifa. The way they do it is by letting Sharia be the law of the land. If they interfere with Sharia, people will rebel against them. If they try to change the Sharia, people will rebel against them. And the ulama would lead the rebellion against them. Right? So they wouldn't touch it, they wouldn't go near it. They'd say, this is your world, you're the ulama, you're the experts, you handle it, we focus on our thing. Right? Because they knew any attempt to mess with the Sharia would cause rebellions, right? And cause people to turn against them. So that's why they didn't really interfere with that. But they did make laws on secondary issues that Islam doesn't talk about. Like Islam doesn't tell you what traffic laws should be. So it's perfectly fine for the ruler to make traffic laws and people to follow that.
Did the Sharia, did they never critique the rulers based on like their lavish lifestyle?
I mean, there are incidents. There are many. So Abu Hanifa died in jail, Ibn Taymiyyah died in jail, because there were points in their life where there's a clash, right? And so you find, for example, one scholar would live for 90 years, and he maybe at 1 year in those 90 years in a clash between him and the Khalifa, and he goes to jail, and then the rest of it is separate. So there are clashes taking place, but not like it's an everyday thing or it's happening all the time. It's more like when the Khalifa does something that seems to be changing the Sharia, then they would step up. So one good example of this in early history, in the time of the Sahaba, there was a tyrant governor who because people, Eid Salah, the khutbah is after the Salah, right? So when this tyrant was giving the Eid khutbah, people used to go away, they didn't want to listen to him speak. So he flipped it around and he started giving the khutbah before the Salah. The ulama stood up and criticized him, said this is bid'ah, you can't change the religion. Right? And they stood up and they criticized him and they rebelled against him until he went back to the sunnah of having a khutbah after Salah. Right? And when he told him about people are not staying for my khutbah, they said that's your problem. Right? If you don't give a good khutbah, it's your problem. You can't change the religion because nobody likes your khutbah. So they did take a stand, and that's why you'll find many of the biographies of our scholars, there is this point where they are martyred or they are in jail because they were very vocal when the rulers tried to change Allah's law. Jazakallah khair. Alhamdulillah, excellent questions today. I think we can close off now, unless there's any other important questions. Alhamdulillah, Jazakallah khair.
I just want to know, your course that you mentioned, is that political or is it like both?
It's both. Like life is messy, everything's a bit of a both, right? In their view, it's not politics, it's defending Allah's Sharia against politicians. That's the way they do.
She's asking about your course.
Hmm?
Your course.
About your course.
My course.
Oh.
Is it political?
My course online is the political history. It's just the political history. Although I do discuss the the scientific developments as well. So I have like 2 hours going through all the science that Muslim developed, what the key sciences are. But 90% of the course is political history, and then I do 3 hours of the history of the madhabs, because I think that's a part of our history that's very misunderstood. How and why the madhabs developed and what was the necessity of the madhabs. But 90% of the course is politics. Right? It's going into the Ottoman Empire for 8 hours, going into the Abbas Empire for 4 hours, just breaking it down at that level, and yeah, it's a political course. Jazakallah khairan wa bidawana, alhamdulillah rabbil alamin.